All right, ready for a deep dive. We're tackling something we all know and maybe love a little too much: sugar. But this isn't just about empty calories or sugar rush. We're going deep into the science, the history, even comparing sugar to things you might not expect, like alcohol.
It's fascinating, really. Sugar is something we encounter every single day, but when you start peeling back the layers, it's way more complex and honestly a little concerning than many people realize.
Okay, concerning how? Lay it on me.
Well, have you ever heard the phrase, refined sugar is more poison than alcohol?
Whoa, that's a pretty bold statement. Are we saying ditch the cocktails and go for candy instead?
Not quite. It's not about a one-to-one comparison. The source is highlighting how these substances interact with our brains. You see, when you drink too much alcohol, the effects are often immediate and obvious, right? You might feel dizzy, lose your coordination. It's obviously toxic.
Yeah, you usually feel it pretty quickly.
Exactly. But sugar, it's sneaky. It doesn't trigger those same alarm bells. Instead, it creates this roller coaster of intense cravings, energy spikes, and then boom, you crash as your blood sugar plummets. And what happens when the roller coaster stops? You want to get right back on.
So it's like this addictive cycle, even though we might not experience those immediate negative effects like we do with too much alcohol.
Precisely. And the source actually describes this incredible study done with mice that really illustrates this point. The researchers gave these mice a choice: sugar water or drugs.
Okay, this I've got to hear. Did the mice stage a tiny intervention?
No, not quite. They overwhelmingly chose the sugar water, even when the drugs were readily available.
No way. You're kidding, right?
Nope, it's wild, isn't it? And get this, researchers at Princeton actually recreated this experiment and got similar results. They even used MRI scans to observe what was happening in the mice brains.
Okay, spill the tea. What was going on in those little mouse brains? Were they throwing a rave in there?
Basically, both the sugar and the drugs were triggering the release of dopamine, the feel-good chemical. So we're chasing that sugar high in a similar way that some people might seek out drugs.
It's like we're wired to crave it. This makes you wonder how much of our sugar consumption is driven by our body's actual needs versus this almost addictive quality the source describes.
That is the million-dollar question, and it gets even more concerning when you consider how early this exposure to sugar begins for many people. Even baby milk powder often contains surprisingly high levels of sugar. It makes you wonder if we're setting ourselves up for these cravings from a very, very young age.
Wow, that is a lot to process. And speaking of processing, the source also delves into the history of sugar, which I found fascinating.
Oh, absolutely. It's quite a journey. For a long time, sugar was a luxury good. Royalty, especially European royalty, were obsessed. This demand eventually fueled exploration, colonization, and unfortunately, the exploitation of enslaved people to cultivate sugarcane.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. Something we often take for granted has this dark and complicated history intertwined with colonialism and capitalism.
Absolutely. And then as we move into the 20th century, the conversation starts to shift to sugar's health impacts. Heart disease is on the rise, and scientists are trying to figure out the culprits. And this is where things get interesting.
Oh, I remember this. Was this the great fat versus sugar debate? Because for a while there, fat was public enemy number one.
Yeah.
I grew up with low-fat everything.
Exactly. And the source really digs into the work of a scientist named Ancel Keys, whose research was incredibly influential in shaping this public opinion against dietary fat.
So was Keys wrong? Was he missing the mark on sugar's role?
Well, it's a bit nuanced. The source raises some questions about his methodology. Specifically, he narrowed his research down to 7 countries, and this might have skewed his findings.
Of a limited sample size, okay, got it.
Exactly. And so some experts argue that the singular focus on fat overshadowed the very real and concerning role of sugar in our diets.
So maybe we got a little sidetracked, and this focus on fat actually benefited the food industry. Those companies producing all those processed foods loaded with, you guessed it, sugar.
That's exactly the argument. They were able to capitalize on this fat-free craze and market their products as these healthier alternatives, even though many were packed with sugar.
Which brings us to this idea of calories in, calories out that dominated dietary advice for so long.
Yeah.
Does that even hold up anymore?
Not really. The source emphasizes that while calories matter, it's not just about how much we eat, but what we eat. Our bodies process the calories from a candy bar very differently from, say, the calories from a plate of vegetables.
Yeah, it's like comparing apples and, candy bars. They both provide energy, but the way our bodies use that energy is totally different.
Exactly. And to fully understand that, we need to take a closer look at the science of how our bodies handle sugar. We should talk about glucose and fructose.
Okay, so glucose and fructose, these tiny sugar molecules are like zipping around in our bloodstreams. It's like a microscopic sugar rush happening inside us right now. But what's the difference?
Yeah.
I mean, they're both sugars, right?
Yeah, they're both sugars, but our bodies deal with them in totally different ways.
Okay, how so?
Well, think of glucose like your body's primary energy source. You know, it's the fuel that keeps everything running. It's a simple sugar that your cells can use directly for energy.
So that's what we're talking about when we say blood sugar.
Exactly.
Like when I use that little finger prick test thing.
Yep, exactly that. When you eat carbs, bread, pasta, fruit, you name it, your digestive system breaks them down into glucose, which then enters your bloodstream. Then insulin comes along, acting like a key to unlock the doors of your cells, allowing that glucose to enter and be used as energy.
So insulin's like the bouncer at the club, making sure the glucose gets in and does its thing. What happens if there's too much glucose hanging around?
Yeah, so your liver and muscles can store some glucose as glycogen.
Glycogen, okay.
Think of it like your backup energy reserve, but these storage units, they only have so much space.
Sounds familiar. My closet's the same way.
Right. So any excess glucose that can't be used or stored well, your body gets resourceful and converts it into fat.
So that's how those extra cookies can end up sticking around a little longer than we like. It's like our bodies have this internal storage system, and once it's full, everything else gets converted to, well, us.
Oh, okay. But what about fructose? You said our bodies can't process it the same way. What happens to that sugar rush?
So fructose is interesting because it's your liver that's almost exclusively responsible for handling it.
Okay.
While your body can utilize small amounts, large doses of fructose, like you might find in sugary drinks and processed foods, it can overwhelm your liver.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Imagine your liver is like a sugar processing plant.
Okay.
And if you flood it with too much fructose, it just can't keep up. And that's when problems can arise.
Problems like, don't leave me hanging.
Well, one potential issue is a buildup of fat in the liver, which over time can lead to something called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease.
And it's important to note that this isn't just about people who drink alcohol excessively. This can happen with excessive fructose consumption from added sugars.
Wow, that's kind of alarming. Our source even compares fructose to an undrinkable alcohol because of how it's metabolized in the liver.
Yeah, it's really similar.
Wow, it really makes you think twice about that extra can of soda, right?
Absolutely. The similarities in how our bodies process excess fructose and alcohol are striking, and they can potentially lead to similar health issues down the line.
So all this talk about glucose, fructose storage, and fat, it really highlights how our bodies aren't just these passive vessels, right?
Yeah.
It's like there's this whole intricate dance happening inside us every time we eat.
100%. Our bodies are constantly responding to what we consume, and those responses have real consequences.
Consequences. So that makes me think we have to touch on AGs.
Oh, yeah, AGs, they're not so great.
AGEs, that sounds a lot like, aging.
Right.
Please tell me sugar isn't going to speed up wrinkles.
Well, they do have a connection to aging, but not in the way you might think.
No.
AGEs stand for Advanced Glycation End Products.
Advanced glycation end products.
Yeah, basically when we consume a lot of sugar, those sugar molecules can actually latch onto proteins in our bodies, and that process creates these compounds called AGEs. And unfortunately, AGEs can damage those proteins, interfering with how they're supposed to function.
So damage, how? What are we talking here?
Well, AGEs are linked to inflammation throughout the body.
Inflammation, right?
Which we know can contribute to a whole host of health issues, from heart disease to arthritis, even Alzheimer's disease. They can also mess with collagen and elastin, the proteins that keep our skin firm and youthful.
So these tiny little gremlins wreaking havoc on our insides.
Yeah.
And speeding up wrinkles on the outside.
Pretty much.
Man, no wonder those beauty gurus are always going on about sugar.
And it's not just about vanity. The source points out that AGEs can actually stiffen blood vessels, increasing the risk of high blood pressure and heart problems.
Oh, wow.
And because our brains are so reliant on healthy protein function, AGEs have been implicated in cognitive decline as well.
Okay, so we're not just talking about, a sugar rush and a crash here. We're talking about our hearts, our brains, how we age. This stuff has serious lasting power.
It really does.
Yeah.
And this is why understanding the science is so important. It's not simply a matter of calories in, calories out.
Right.
It's about the types of calories we consume and how those choices affect our bodies over time.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
Mm-hmm.
Sugar tricks our brains. It's metabolized differently from alcohol. There's insulin, these pesky AGEs, the whole shebang. But I have to admit, it's easy to feel a little overwhelmed by all this information. Like, okay, sugar is sneaky and potentially harmful, but what do we do with this knowledge? I mean, knowing all this about sugar is great, but it's almost like, where do we even go from here? Should we all just swear off sugar entirely and live these, like, sugar-free lives?
Well, and that's the hard part, right? Our source talks about how pervasive sugar is, like it's everywhere. Even when you're trying to eat healthy, added sugars are lurking in so many processed foods,
Yeah.
often disguised under different names.
Tell me about it. I've definitely been caught out by those sneaky sugars. Like, you think you're making a healthy choice, and then bam, you look at the label, and it's a sugar overload.
Oh, yeah, it can feel like a losing battle sometimes.
It really can. So what do we do?
Well, it's not about being perfect. It's about making informed choices, right? And one thing that can make a big difference is simply reading those nutrition labels carefully.
Become a label detective.
Exactly. You start to spot those hidden sugars, especially in things like sauces, dressings, even
Yeah.
bread.
Oh, yeah. Bread is a sneaky one. So
Yeah.
beyond scrutinizing every single label, what else can we do?
Focusing on whole, unprocessed foods as much as possible. It's huge.
Okay.
Think fruits, vegetables, lean proteins, nuts and seeds.
The good stuff.
Right. These foods provide more sustained energy without those drastic sugar spikes and crashes.
It's like getting back to basics, right?
Yeah.
Cooking more at home, really being mindful of what we're putting into our bodies.
Exactly. And remember, this isn't about deprivation. It's about making swaps and finding healthier ways to satisfy those sweet cravings.
Right. Like, instead of that sugary soda, maybe opt for some sparkling water with a squeeze of lemon or lime. Or instead of a processed granola bar, reach for a handful of almonds and a piece of fruit.
There you go. Those are great examples. Small changes over time can really make a big difference.
Yeah, it all adds up, right?
Yeah, right. And don't be afraid to experiment. There are so many delicious and naturally sweet alternatives out there. Dates, berries, or even a little bit of dark chocolate can really hit the spot.
It's about finding what works for you and your lifestyle. And hey, remember, you don't have to do it alone. If you're struggling, don't hesitate to reach out to a registered dietitian or a healthcare professional. They can provide some personalized guidance. At the end of the day, this is about taking control of our health and well-being.
I couldn't agree more. It's about making choices that empower us, not choices that leave us feeling addicted or out of control.
We've explored a lot in this deep dive into the world of sugar. We've talked about the science, the history, how sugar can secretly sneak into our diets. But there's one thing I hope you take away from this conversation. It's this. Knowledge is power. The more aware we are of the sugar we're consuming, understanding its effects on our bodies, the better equipped we are to make informed choices that support our health and well-being. So next time you reach for that sweet treat, remember what we've discussed today and ask yourself, is this serving my body or just feeding a craving? Choose wisely, friends, because when it comes to sugar, the sweetest choice isn't always the most obvious.